Very good. Let's take a question from the audience up here on the let's get you mic'd up. Okay, go.
So my question is actually related to this, though maybe twisted in a slightly different way. You know, the elephant in the room has always been, you know, what are the insurance companies going to do with this information? That's always been perceived, you know, publicly as the risk. And so I guess my question, you know, maybe to both of you, so for the decode, are you going to make that information, once you have the sequences available, public, such that a particular individual could go and look up what their risks are? And for the PGP, I know that the intent there is to make all the information public. And so I guess I'd be interested in your opinions as to, if we have enough public information, enough public sequence available, will that intrinsically mitigate those risks? You know, because, you know, once all that information is available, everyone's going to have some kind of genetic, you know, probabilistic potential for disease, and it may be that when you aggregate that across the population, if we have enough public data available, that will intrinsically mitigate those risks, which is what's being talked about a lot in the public domain right now.
Dan.
Well, you know, the first answer to your question is that in the United States, at least, we now have a law that addresses that. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, was passed in 2008. It took about, I think, 13 years to wend its way through Congress, but it was finally passed. And that does address some of those issues specifically. It addresses employment discrimination based on genetic information, which includes family history. It also addresses insurance discrimination, but only for health care insurance. It doesn't address long-term care, disability, and life insurance. So, you know, partly I think there's a legislative and there will be a regulatory response to address some of those fears. I agree that they have been generally fairly widespread amongst people that have been asked, but not well documented as far as, you know, actual abuse or misuse of genetic information by insurers. I think, you know, longer term, we have a question to ask ourselves about how is the insurance industry really going to work. You know, is the concept of insurance fundamentally, you know, consistent with telling insurers that you cannot, you know, take into account any of this information when you're insuring people? We understand that there's, you know, some really strong sort of moral, you know, objection to having people with, you know, they got a bad draw on the genetic lottery, or, you know, however you want to frame it, and then they can't get insurance, or it's too expensive to get insurance. But is the right approach to really require insurers to sort of bury their heads and ignore that information while individuals have access to it? I don't know, and I think that's something that's going to play out over the course of the next decade. You know, as more and more people have access to this information, and GINA and, you know, PGP and putting the information in the public domain is going to help sort of spur those conversations, but there's a long way left to go.
But it is complicated with the insurance, because the insurance industry is there to spread risk. And if we weed most of the risk out by the use of the genetics information, the use of the insurance companies becomes relatively little. Those with very, very high risk of bad diseases are going to be charged very, very high premiums, and it may not even be worthwhile for them to buy it. And those who have very little risk have very little incentive to buy the insurance. So I think that the insurance industry will have to figure out how to intelligently use it, if they will be allowed to use it. When it comes to sort of public domain placement of data, you see, we are in the business of making discoveries, and we do not want to have a high barrier for people to participate. And we definitely don't want to place our data indiscriminately into public domain. We do not want to encourage people to do that. And there is a law in Iceland based on the directives of the European Union that makes it illegal to do so. And I actually think there is the wisdom of NIAs to demand that those who get funding from NIAs to do genetic study, they place both phenotypic and genotypic data into a sort of public domain database, is in violation of a sort of this fundamental concept of trying to protect the participants in research to make, you know, more likely that people will participate.
Jamie.
You know, that contrast is really interesting, because I think what we're struggling with, and I think there's two sets of rights that are being violated here. One is there is a right to privacy, so you should not have society force disclosure upon you. But there's also a right to free speech. And there are laws in the US and laws in Europe that essentially prevent an individual from aggregating their data with other individuals in a project basis. So we have a situation where there are laws that sort of would say, well, I know you're a reporter for the New York Times, and I know all these people volunteer, but you're really not legally allowed to talk about that. And I think the question I'm interested in, and I love an invention of the PGP, by the way, which is just brilliant, which is the idea of consent at the PGP is not the BS consent that we all use in industry, which is, did you sign away your legal right to sue me even though you don't really understand? But it's a true concept of consent, which is a test, which I failed the first time I took it. Now, I'll disagree on the answer to one of the questions, and George and I can fight about that later. But you have to pass this exam that shows you understand the consequence. And I think the probability of getting through that exam and having not understood the consequences that they thought through brilliantly at the PGP, releasing your genetic data, is very, very low. So this question, Kara, I think the question will be interesting. Will the open systems, which there are clearly 10% of any society that's willing to say, hey, I'm naked, I'm good, I'm there, versus the 10% that say, don't you dare tell anyone, my eye color. And if you're operating to protect the most restrictive, secret 10%, I don't like the word private, versus protecting the rights of the open 10%, I think the open 10 is going to win. I think that they're going to provide enough data for us all to figure these problems out in a really powerful way. And the power of open data sets versus ones where you can't drill to the individual level is just so limiting. I think it's just going to happen.
I wholeheartedly disagree with you.
I know.
And let's just compare what we have discovered and you have discovered. We have been very successful with a system that is designed to protect the people who participate. We are working with participation of a very large percentage of a nation, all right, that is very proud and to a certain extent very private. And I think that privacy is something that we should respect, and we can do extraordinarily powerful research in spite of protecting people's privacy. There are all kinds of ways to do that. For example, we are working with a third-party encryption system that allows us, given permission by our data protection authorities and by ethics committee, to go time and again to the same people. But we never need to disclose anything. And actually just depositing, I can tell you one of our good people sat down at the computer the other day and looked at the HapMap data. And he could, in a few minutes, figure out that one of the members there was half Icelandic. And it was a really easy stuff to figure out who this person is. And I think that to say that it is just enough to anonymize sequence data, etc., and put it in a database and nobody can figure out who it is, that's just an illusion. All right? And we have to, if we want people to continue to participate freely in our research, we have to be able to provide protection of the privacy.